Hey there, CPO here, and yeah, Overclocked is back on a lift. What are we doing today? That's a great question. Thanks for asking. Today's drive shaft day. All right, so here are the two new drive shafts, front and rear. You can tell these are mine because they have my name on them, and they have the measurements I sent in, 45.5 for the rear. And if you remember correctly in my measurement video, I said it was 45 and 5/8, and I wondered if they were going to round it down to a half, and it looks like they did. And then this was my measurement for the front, and that was 37.25, and that's what's written there. So good, those transferred properly. So there's an open immediately. Let's check out and see what kind of information they have for us. All right. Of course, we have a sticker. So we have installation instructions for the JK drive shaft. And what do we have here? These are probably more generic instructions. Oh, nice. More stickage. Looks like a white decal, black decal. Nice yellow sticker. And maintenance instructions and basic drive shaft. So yeah, generic instructions and maintenance, and then because this is a JK specific build, instructions specific to that vehicle. So that's kind of cool. They also give this handy service tool, which is for the to grease the Zerk fittings in the U-joints. So that's kind of nice to give that. I already have one of these, but if I didn't, this would be really handy. All right, there's the two shafts now out of their protective plastic encasement. I did also order a U-joint straps for the front, and there was like, I don't know, a few bucks, so I went ahead and had them throw that in there. Obviously another service tool, and it comes with whatever you need. In my case, I needed to replace both sides. This is the rear, so I needed to replace the flange on the transfer case and add the yoke to the differential, and it comes with those. One thing that I was kind of curious about, and I was like, well, I didn't see, they're supposed to give you new nuts for the pinions and stuff, but hey, look at there, they're trapped inside there. So if you pull it apart like I did and freak out because you don't have a nut, don't worry, they're probably just stuffed in there. And then this is the front. I already have a yoke on the front drive shaft, so they basically have everything ready for me to strap that on. And I needed the new flange for where it connects to the transfer case for the front drive line. So probably the most fascinating thing for me is the fact that they built these and had them shipped the day I called them. Like, I called them in the morning with my measurements, and they were shipped that afternoon. And I had to get them here in time because I'm trying to finish this build, and they accommodated me, and it was pretty awesome. So that's impressive all by itself. Look at the difference here, though, in the size of a 1350 and a 1310. So just so you're aware, my front drive shaft is a 1310. My rear drive shaft is a 1350. After we get through the install in this video, I'll explain to you why that is, what I took into account for that decision, and then what you may want to take into account if you make a decision such as this. But you can see the size difference between the 1350 U-joints and the 1310s. It's pretty significant. Now, they don't just slap on bigger U-joints and charge you a couple $100. There's some other things that have to get beefed up as well to that. But I do have a smaller front drive shaft than rear drive shaft in that regard. And that's by design, and I think that that's going to be a good fit for me. So anyway, let's get to installing this. All right, so if you recall correctly, it wasn't very long ago that we upgraded the rear differential, and I installed that new front axle right there. Never did get a front drive shaft in, waited until I could get proper measurements, which you might have seen that video. And then now both the rear and the fronts are in, so it's time to swap these guys out. And yes, I am in the shop. You can do this in your garage. I'll talk about that here in a little bit.
Oh heck, let's just do it right now. So I took this to the shop because of a couple of reasons. One, Paul just redid the ring and pinion on that rear differential, and I wanted him to feel comfortable that I didn't do anything to disrupt his pinion preload that he spent so much time getting just right. Secondly, it gives me an opportunity to run a camera while he does the work. Thanks Paul. And basically gives us a great view of this process. Plus, he's going to get some expert tips on things that you might want to consider as you're doing this, even if you're doing it on your own. And then he's also going to go through the difference of the stock drive shaft versus the Tom Woods double cardan drive shaft that we're installing. And at the very end, I'll talk to you a little bit about what you need to consider when you make your drive shaft selection.
All right, so we're pulling this nut off and removing this flange here. And we're pulling this nut off and removing this flange here.
Okay, this is we're just removing the factory yoke here off the rear of this transfer case. This is nothing but a homemade tool that I use just to get the yokes off. We end up putting an impact gun on this nut, but this tool just makes it a little easier to deal with the yoke as compared to trying to fit a pipe wrench or channel locks in this tight space. So it's really just to make things easier for us. But a big wrench does do the same job. And that's the old pinion nut off. If you look closely here, sometimes this pulls off by hand, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, the yoke's on too tight, and I'm gonna have to get a puller. But this, there's a big black O-ring in there, like an oversized O-ring. What that's for from the factory is to prevent oil from coming up the splines of the yoke. So when the new yoke goes on, we're gonna deal with that in a different way. But it's good for people to know what that is if they're doing their own regular maintenance, that either needs to be put back or you deal with preventing the oil from sliding up the splines of the yoke in a different way. So this same basic process is repeated for all 4 yokes. Each yoke may look a little different, but the concept is the same. Splines in the middle, you know, a nut on the end of it, and there it goes. Before, like if you haven't done this before and you're learning to do this the first time, you want to get a feel for, depending on whether you're doing it in the driveway or in a shop, you want to get a feel for how much tension is on this. So we have a little bit of movement in here that's our backlash range, but it is good to get an idea of where you're coming from. So that way you kind of have a mental picture of how to backpedal.
Nice.
Some procedures, if you look into the OEM procedures on how to remove these, I guess we should mention that actually. Some of those procedures advise putting a torque wrench on this and trying to measure how much torque it takes to actually remove this nut. And they want that recorded as a reference. But we're kind of going to be using a different procedure, but that's kind of worth mentioning.
So a rotational torque wrench to figure out the baseline pinion preload?
Yeah, I'm not super sure I agree with that or that it's the best method, but there really are a lot of different ways to do it.
Some leftover Rtv sealant.
So what we've done so far is we've removed a bit of the RTV that sealed the old yoke on these splines, and I've started to clean off these pinion threads. you can kind of see this pinion seal hasn't been in here long, so we're not going to replace it. But worth noting is that you can see the grease that's in this double lip seal. So that's really important. If you don't have grease in a double lip seal like that, and you just put, in this case, the yoke in that seal, what's going to happen is it's going to run hot as this is spinning around. It's not going to have any lubrication. It's really probably going to just burn the seal up. So inside that double lip, it's a concave pocket, really, that's part of the design of the seal. That has to be filled with something. Here in this shop, we use lithium grease, actually. But the other thing that I want to kind of note is that we haven't taken the rear diff cover off. And what we talked about in some of the other videos is that this portion of the axle right here, we have a bearing that lives here and we have a bearing that lives about here. So there is a pocket of gear roll here. And even if we do remove this cover and we drain out all this gear roll, chances are we will have left behind a few ounces of oil right in this spot. So what we know is that we want to get this clean so that the new Loctite works really well. But we also don't really want to fill this axle full of solvent. So what I tend to do is just try to get a piece of a paper towel like this, and I block that. And then I'm going to clean this really good. We actually use brake clean here, but there's a lot of different other solvents that will work fine. But we're going to clean this up and try to do the best we can without putting a lot of, we don't want a couple, 2 or 3 or ounces of solvent into the axle, mixing in with the gear roll. That solvent's going to break down the oil, and it's not a good way forward. So now that we've cleaned this off a bit, we can see our double lip seal. I'm not sure how well you can see that in camera, but there is some grease in there. But what we're going to do is we're going to go back, and I'm going to use a little screwdriver, and we're actually going to paste our way into packing a little bit more grease back into that double lip seal, that concave area where you can see the red lithium grease inside of. So you can't really put too much here. It's not really going to hurt anything. So we're just going to fill that pocket back up. We just used the back of a screwdriver works. This just happens to be a little pry bar. But all 4 of your yokes, or it doesn't matter if you're taking apart a lawnmower, if it has a double lip seal and you take it apart or you're installing a new one or whatever's going on, you really want to take the time and fill that with grease. Some seals do come with grease already pre-packed in them when you buy them. If you buy one like that, great. If not, get some grease and get to packing. If we were putting a new seal in, we would put the grease into the new seal before we tap it into place, which is easier than this. Okay, we're going to talk about these shafts real quick. This shaft here is the original shaft that comes in pretty much all the JKs, and this is the aftermarket famous Tom Woods Driveshaft. This one just happens to be a 1350 series, which means that it has bigger U-joints that can handle more torque, and as you can notice, the diameters are a lot different. The wall thickness of the Woody shaft is a lot more substantial than the bigger looking original factory shaft. So this shaft is bigger in diameter, but the wall thickness of this steel is very, very thin compared to the Tom Woods shaft. These pressed in grooves give a little bit more strength. You can see that both shafts telescope in the middle, so they get longer and shorter as the suspension flexes. So they both move, they both have a spline section to allow for that movement. Up on this end is one of the big reasons why we like to change these shafts. This particular type of joint is called the rzeppa, or pronounced rzeppa, depending on what part of the world you're from. And what we like to do is we like to have this double cardan in up by the transfer case, because this type of joint can handle a bigger angle than this type of joint. And another thing that's really worth noting is that for off-road use, if you take a good look at how this shaft is made, and even if you look in there, you can see bits of dirt and stuff. As I turn this, they're rolling inside. So what happens is, as the tires kick up dirt and everything that happens off-road, the inside of this area, as it's spinning around, gets caked up with that bits of grit and mud and whatever. So the inside of this, if you were to remove this boot, kind of has a bit of a interesting starfish shape to it with some moving parts. Once this boot tears, the debris that land in this area, as it spins centrifugally, makes its way outward into the inner working moving parts of this joint. So as soon as this boot tears, this type of joint has very little lifespan left. And another tip for people that still have this type of shaft in their vehicle, when you go on your weekend off-roading adventures, take a good look at these boots and at least try to spray them out with water, get that debris out. So if you park this overnight and it's got some Rosh Creek famous clay that starts off wet and slimy but dries like a solid rock, overnight it's going to dry out, and what seemed like mud in there the next morning is more like a sharp object. So as soon as the vehicle starts rolling again after it's been parked for a little while, sometimes that dried up clump of hard clay has the ability just to cut right into the boot. So if you're holding on to this design for a while, just make sure you're trying to do your best and keep that clean. Ultimately, they are really going to fail for anyone who tries to use them for a serious off-road use. It's just not going to last long at all. And it really is not just because of the difference in the angles the two can handle, but just the fact that this design really relies on that boot, and as soon as the boot fails, really that is about the end of the joint. The other thing I could say is that in normal use, even if you don't take your vehicle off-road, these boots dry out and crack. So spraying any sort of silicone or anything like that into those boots to keep them from prematurely dry rotting is going to do good things. So that's pretty much the deal with this type of shaft. On-road use, minimal, very minimal to no vibration. It is a good shaft. It just doesn't do great in the harsher off-road environments. So now over here to the Tom Woods shaft, things we want to point out with this that I'm sure have been covered a gazillion times, but how to take care of this is really important. Okay, so we've got 3 places to lubricate this end. There's a lot of trade names floating around for this type of joint. The most commonly one is the double cardan, but it's also commonly referred to as a CV joint, which kind of stands for constant velocity. But more accurately, this is a double cardan. And we have a grease fitting here, and that's going to grease the first U joint. And we have a different type of a grease fitting here that's going to grease this one. And then if you look really close, there is another needle point grease fitting down there. So it's kind of nice how these are lined up it'll help people to find that one a little bit easier. And the reason this has a special type of grease fitting on it that uses a needle point grease gun tip that comes with the Tom Woods shaft is that at more sharper rotating angles, the U-joint would get bent or just broken off. So it's a clearance issue, which is why that it has a different type of a grease fitting on it. And this type of shaft, it's very strong, and the idea is to put the bad angle up at the transfer case and then point the pinion from the axle straight up at this shaft. So this type of shaft works best with the type of a rear suspension that you can re-clock your pinion angle to match the shaft for the best driveline vibration. Whereas the rzeppa joint, the way it wants to work is it's designed to have this angle and this angle match each other. So the driveline angle from the transfer case with this type needs to be parallel to the driveline angle of the actual pinion in the axle. So moving to this type of shaft to get the best performance out of it and its best chance at minimal driveline vibrations is to be reclocking your axle. To share what we're trying to do here is we're putting about the smallest amount of RTV that I can get with my fingers into this side of these splines. So I find it works better if you put it on this side of the splines. That way, as it's sliding onto the yoke, the RTV has somewhere to go. And it's not jamming up the pinion nut. And one last thing we're going to do before we slide the yoke on is this is a good time to go ahead and put the Loctite on the male pinion threads. We've got a little bit of RTV in our splines, so that way the gear roll can't wick its way up the yoke splines. So I'm going to slide this on, and you can kind of see that it was a little bit easier to get the Loctite on the threads before we slide the yoke on. This is our new Pinion Nut Washer that came from Tom Woods. So I'm going to slide that on. And this is probably a little overkill, but it's a shop habit here. I put a few dots of Loctite on our pinion nut. So if you look closely at this pinion nut, it's a very special nut. It's got some claw marks in it, so it's been crushed. This is known as a lock nut, or also commonly known as a top lock nut. It's slightly triangular, so a few of these top threads have been crimped, and when we start to screw this on, you can kind of tell you can go a little ways just by hand, but it doesn't take too long, and we run into the purposely disfigured triangular shape that is really going to make this pinion nut tight and stay tight. So with the help of that function and the Loctite, we're really counting on this not to come loose. We have this yoke tool that we find very handy, and we're going to be torquing our pinion net down to 160 foot-pounds. Our torque wrench is already set to 160. This isn't a super fast process. You just kind of get at it. The use of our special, homemade yoke tool is that, this just kind of jams up here. It's a little safer. You can use both hands, 160 foot-pounds in the driveway underneath your Jeep. If you're going to elect to do it that way, really make sure you're chock in the wheels and however you have this thing jacked up, because pulling 160 foot-pounds on this, you know, is going to really, you know, can rock a vehicle around a little bit. Even here in our shop where we have, you know, these nice professional hydraulic auto lifts, you can kind of see in the background we put jack stands on, you know, just to be extra safe. Even here, we don't want anybody to get hurt because we're manipulating a, you know, drivetrain and heavy suspension parts. So there we're at our 160 foot-pounds. So next thing we do that this special tool really helps us out with this added leverage of this tool, we can grab it, and with this being really solid, you can feel if you don't have this tight enough, and if there's some rocking and moving in the pinion, you can feel it. So right now this one feels really good, so I don't feel any movement in it at all, and I think we're where we want to be. So with the transfer case, we're just repeating all this. We're going to poke our little paper towel in there, try to keep from filling the transfer case up with solvent. I'm going to give these splines a little bit of a wipe, kind of clean out the seal some. You can see that this seal's been in here a good bit longer than the rear seal, and you can see that the double lip of this one is completely empty. So we are going to pack some grease into that. I think I have a pretty good shot at medical school based on my experiences of packing pinion seals.
Or playing the game Operation.
Yeah, Operation, you know, could be good at that. But I don't see why I couldn't get into medical school.
I'm sure it's the same thing as working on Jeeps. It's all basically parts that you have to fit together and make work and keep lubricated.
Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. You know, can't expect everyone to live.
Aftermarket parts.
Put our Loctite on. Loctite makes yoke nuts very happy. Tom Woods is really good about packing all their shafts with grease, and pretty much everything out of the package has got a film of grease on it from when they've greased the splines and the U-joints and everything. But when it comes time to assemble these, we really want all that grease and film gone. And even these female threads here that are ultimately going to be holding the shaft in place, I even make sure that we clean those out so that our Loctite has its real opportunity to do its job.
Okay guys, so Paul's going to continue to do his work here. Basically what we're going to do is the same exact thing we just did to the rear with those two flanges and yokes, we're going to do to the front. And then Paul's going to come back in and install the rear drive shaft and the front drive shaft. I'll kind of let that play in the background, but I did want to talk a little bit about some of the things you need to consider when you are going to make a drive shaft selection. 1350, 1310, those are the popular sizes for the Jeeps, and there's a lot of sort of rules of thumb or guidance that people use to make those decisions. And what I'll tell you is the best thing to do, no question, call Tom Woods, and they will ask you some questions about your vehicle. What size tires are you running? What's your gear ratio? Are you running a heavy rig or a lightweight rig? What type of wheeling do you do? So what I ended up going with after talking with them was a 1350 rear, 1310 in the front. It's not just your tire size that matters. It's not just your gear ratio that matters, right? You got to look at a lot of things and take it all into consideration. And I would just cheat, call Tom Woods, let them tell you what they think is the best option for you. That's it, guys. I'm not gonna, bore you with watching somebody install drive shafts anymore. This video is way long already, so thanks for watching. I'll catch you on the next one.